A flight attendant covered a black teen's mouth with duct tape until his cries went silent. 1 minute later, the CEO wrapped that same tape around the attendant's face until he stopped moving. What happens next will leave you speechless. He taped a baby's mouth shut, silencing his cries, sure no one would rise against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The crying began the moment Adrian Vaylor stepped through the security gate. Sharp, rhythmic, and unrelenting, Elias's wails pierced through the noise of Halston International Airport like a siren. Heads turned. Some passengers scowled, others merely sighed and went back to their phones, but none said a word. Adrian adjusted the baby's position in his arms, rocking gently, whispering against his tiny ear. "It's okay. We're almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to comfort more, his son or himself. The terminal buzzed with tension. Rain slammed against the wide glass panes lining the departure lounge, casting watery shadows on the polished floors. Outside, the sky was a dark curtain, streaked with veins of lightning. Delays loomed over every gate like ghosts. Inside, humanity pressed together, suitcases scraping linoleum, announcements crackling overhead, voices clashing in tired frustration. Adrian moved toward Gate 12, his arms aching from cradling Elias for the past hour. His sharp features, once the face of a calm, composed CEO in dozens of tech magazines, were now pale and drawn, his jaw shadowed with stubble. The tailored coat he wore hung awkwardly from one shoulder where the baby's squirming had tugged it loose. His eyes scanned the gate area, seeking a quiet corner, but there was none. He chose a seat against the window and sank into it with a soft groan. The seat beside him remained empty. A few nearby passengers subtly shifted further away, shielding themselves with newspaper folds or tilted laptops. Adrian barely noticed. His mind was on Casterfield, on the house waiting for them, still filled with unpacked boxes and photographs he hadn't yet had the courage to look at. A fresh start, they called it, but grief wasn't something you left behind with a change of address. Elias cried harder. Adrian reached for the baby's bottle, fumbling through the diaper bag. Formula, blanket, a rattle, everything felt useless. He bounced Elias gently, murmuring again, "It's all right, little man. We'll get through this." Across the gate, a man leaned against the counter in uniform. Flight attendant. Tall, wiry, with perfectly combed black hair and a pressed uniform so crisp it looked like it could cut glass. His name tag read Marcus. But what caught Adrian's attention was the stare. Marcus Wren wasn't just observing the crowd, he was watching them. Watching him. The man's arms were folded, fingers tapping slowly on his bicep, his expression unreadable. But his eyes lingered too long on Elias. Adrian looked away, unsettled, probably just tired. Everyone here looked like they were about to crack. The gate agent announced that boarding would begin in 20 minutes. A few passengers rose instinctively, forming a premature line that spilled awkwardly into the waiting area. Adrian stayed seated, rocking Elias, who whimpered now in short, high-pitched hiccups of exhaustion. A man seated 2 rows away groaned under his breath, loud enough for Adrian to hear. "Should have booked the no-kid zone." Adrian didn't respond. He had learned not to. The last few months had taught him to hold his emotions close, like currency, not to be spent unless absolutely necessary. But Marcus noticed. The attendant stepped forward, making his way slowly around the perimeter of the lounge. His stride was confident, practiced. He paused every few feet, adjusting signs, nodding at staff, but his eyes always drifted back to Adrian and Elias. "Need assistance, sir?" Marcus asked when he finally approached, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. Adrian shook his head, polite but firm. "We're all right." Marcus glanced down at Elias, who had finally begun to quiet. A long pause stretched between them, too long for a simple check-in. Then, with a curt nod, Marcus turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile like the ticking of a slow fuse. Adrian felt his skin crawl. Something about the man's demeanor didn't sit right. The way he watched, the way he smiled without it touching his eyes, the way he moved with control so precise it felt performative. The storm outside deepened. Thunder rumbled like a warning under the floor. Elias stirred again, whimpering. Adrian pulled the blanket tighter around him. As he reached into the bag for a pacifier, he felt something. Someone. Watching again. He turned quickly. Marcus was now at the far side of the gate, speaking with another male crew member, but his gaze still drifted back, unwavering. Adrian's thoughts churned. He had read enough reports in his line of work, incident summaries, behavioral patterns, risk assessments. He had learned that it wasn't the loud ones who posed the greatest threat. It was the ones who said nothing at all, the ones who smiled too easily, the ones whose eyes never blinked. A gate agent tapped the microphone, breaking the silence. Flight 407 to Casterfield is now ready to board. We'll begin with passengers requiring assistance, those traveling with infants. Adrian rose, adjusting Elias in his arms. The boy had finally quieted, his breathing light against his father's chest. They walked to the gate together, slow and steady. As Adrian handed over his boarding pass, he caught Marcus standing just past the threshold of the boarding bridge, arms folded again, smirk tugging at one side of his lips. The man's gaze drifted to the child, then to Adrian, and for a split second, it wasn't irritation in his expression. It was something colder, sharper. Adrian's grip tightened around his son. Some storms do not start in the clouds but in the hearts of men. The engines howled as the plane broke through the cloud line, their deep roar rumbling through the cabin floor. The lights overhead flickered once before settling into a dim, sterile glow. Adrian Vaylor sat upright in his seat near the center of the aircraft, gently rocking his infant son Elias in his arms. The baby whimpered softly, his cries more tired than urgent now, but the sound still drew subtle flinches from nearby passengers. Adrian whispered lullabies, his voice low and steady, willing his son into calmness. One hand cradled the back of Elias's head, the other gently patted his side. He didn't dare look away, not even for a moment. Across the aisle, Marcus Wren moved down the row like a shadow. The flight attendant's motions were sharp, his shoulders tense, lips pinched in a thin, irritated line. He ignored a passenger who raised a hand for assistance. When another asked for a blanket, Marcus responded with a curt, "No more left," and kept walking. His footsteps didn't echo, but Adrian still felt them, like pressure building on the side of his skull. He glanced up briefly, just long enough to see Marcus throw a smirk at the passenger he'd dismissed. The man blinked in surprise but said nothing. No one did. Politeness bound them all in silence. Adrian studied Marcus discreetly. His training as a CEO had taught him to read people in boardrooms and negotiation tables, watching for the flick of an eyebrow, the hitch of a breath, anything that betrayed intent. And now, even in this unfamiliar setting, his instincts were stirred. There was something unnatural in Marcus's composure, something barely hidden beneath the surface. Every movement the man made seemed taut with friction, as if held together by the thinnest thread. Elias's cry rose again, louder this time, and Adrian adjusted his hold. "It's okay," he murmured, brushing the baby's cheek with his thumb. "We'll be home soon." A man a row ahead sighed and shifted in his seat. Another passenger glanced back just for a moment before turning away with tight lips. Adrian caught it all. He knew the sound of a plane cabin turning against a crying child, not with words, but with glances and tension so thick it warped the air. He felt the weight of judgment crawling up his spine. He'd expected this. He hadn't expected Marcus. The attendant's eyes flicked toward them again. Not just a glance, long, cold, unblinking. Marcus didn't look at Adrian. He looked at Elias, his gaze narrowing like a blade honing in. There was no empathy in his face, no effort to mask the contempt. Adrian stiffened. He shifted Elias closer to his chest and met Marcus's stare directly. For a split second they held each other's gaze, and then Marcus turned, as if nothing had happened. Adrian's heartbeat quickened. His rational mind fought to calm the growing unease. He thought of a report he'd once read, about stress in high-altitude environments, confined spaces, unpredictable passengers, sleep deprivation, all contributing to irrational, even violent outbursts among airline staff. He'd skimmed the findings at the time, more interested in the implications for insurance liability than the human behavior beneath. But now, those words felt like they were being written in real time. Marcus returned down the aisle, this time slower. His hands were behind his back, and Adrian's eyes dropped momentarily to the utility pouch fastened at his waist. A roll of duct tape sat there, partially exposed. Marcus's fingers twitched near it. It might have been nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. "Would you like anything?" Another flight attendant asked a passenger across the aisle. Adrian didn't hear the answer. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, who had paused at the galley entrance. He stood there for several seconds, staring at nothing in particular, jaw clenched. Then he turned and scanned the cabin once more. His gaze passed over everyone, except Adrian and Elias. When it reached them, it stayed. Adrian turned slightly in his seat, shielding Elias with his shoulder. He spoke again, quietly but firmly. "Shh. I've got you, little one. I've got you." Marcus took a step forward. A man, 2 rows up, flagged him down. "Excuse me, can I get—" "Ask someone else," Marcus snapped without breaking stride. The man blinked, confused, and slowly lowered his hand. Adrian's grip on Elias tightened. The baby whimpered again, his face scrunching. Adrian rocked faster, almost rhythmically, trying to smother the storm of thoughts rising in his head. Every part of his body was alert now. He wasn't just a father calming his son, he was a sentinel guarding a fortress. The murmurs in the cabin began to rise. Passengers were noticing. A woman leaned across the aisle and whispered something to her seatmate, her eyes glancing toward Marcus. Another man shifted uncomfortably, his gaze bouncing between Adrian and the flight attendant. The mood was no longer quiet discomfort, it was cautious anticipation. Marcus moved again, this time passing behind Adrian's seat. The hair on the back of Adrian's neck stood up as he felt the presence at his shoulder. He turned slightly, enough to see Marcus reach up to adjust a panel above the storage bins, though there seemed no reason for it. The duct tape on his pouch was now fully visible. Adrian's pulse thudded in his ears. He leaned back, eyes darting to the other attendants who were now huddled near the service cart. They were whispering nervously. One of them, a younger man with a shaved head and trembling hands, looked over at Marcus with uncertainty before lowering his gaze again. No one was in control. Adrian could see it clearly. Then came the smirk. Marcus turned his head just enough to let Adrian catch it, the same curved lip he'd seen earlier. Not amused, not playful. It was the smirk of a man who knew something others didn't. A private joke shared only with himself. Adrian didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. Elias coughed again, his cry cracking from exhaustion. Marcus looked down at him like one might look at a dripping faucet, annoyed, offended, and ready to end the sound by any means necessary. Adrian's thoughts turned sharp, fast. He calculated options. Call an attendant. Cause a scene. But every choice carried risk. If he overreacted, he'd be blamed. If he waited too long, the danger might already be unfolding. He looked around the cabin again, searching for allies, for cameras, for anything to anchor him in the rising tide of unease. Marcus walked away slowly, back toward the galley, but his posture was even stiffer now, his arms hanging straight down, hands flexing open and closed. Adrian knew what he had seen, and he knew what it meant. Marcus wasn't just irritated, he wasn't tired or overworked, he was dangerous. Sometimes silence hides a scream waiting to break free. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, a shallow calm settled across the cabin. Trays clinked faintly as attendants began their routines, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to tired whispers and shifting seatbelts. But one sound pierced through it all, Elias's cries, sharp and unrelenting, rising in pitch like a siren no one could silence. Adrian Vaylor shifted his son in his arms aching from the weight, his chest heavy with helplessness. He rocked Elias gently, whispering softly into the baby's ear, a lullaby that once soothed his wife when she couldn't sleep. But tonight, nothing worked. The child's cries pushed harder against the tight space of the aircraft, each wail cutting through the fragile piece like a blade. Passengers around them began to stir uncomfortably. A businessman in the next row huffed and tugged his blanket up. Another man across the aisle muttered something under his breath, then leaned over with an irritated glare. "Can you control your kid?" the man hissed, his voice low but sharp. Adrian turned his head slowly, his jaw clenched. He said nothing. There was no anger in his face, only exhaustion and sorrow, the kind that didn't beg for sympathy but made it clear he didn't need anyone's approval. His grip on Elias tightened just slightly, as if shielding the child from the world's sharp edges. A rustle of movement caught his attention. Down the aisle came Marcus Wren, the flight attendant with eyes like frozen steel. His expression was unreadable, his steps silent. He stopped just a few feet away, not speaking, just watching. Adrian noticed how his hands remained at his sides, fingers twitching faintly, as if resisting some buried urge. Marcus's gaze locked on Elias, the corners of his mouth twitching, not in sympathy, but in something far darker. Adrian's skin prickled. Marcus leaned in slightly, just enough to make his presence known. "Need help?" he asked, voice clipped, eyes never leaving the child. "No," Adrian said firmly, shielding Elias with his arm. "We're fine." But Marcus didn't back away. Instead, he bent lower, closer to the child. Elias recoiled instinctively, his tiny body flinching as though it sensed the wrongness in the man. Adrian shifted, turning his shoulder between them, forcing Marcus back a step. The attendant smiled then, barely, but it was there. A thin, joyless smile that didn't touch his eyes. It was not the smile of someone trying to be polite. It was the smile of someone rehearsing a moment in his mind, a twisted satisfaction hiding just beneath the surface. "Just trying to keep the peace," Marcus muttered, almost too quiet to hear. Adrian's instincts flared. He had spent years reading boardrooms, catching the shifts in a man's posture before a deal turned sour. What he saw in Marcus now wasn't frustration, it was fixation. The kind that didn't come from a single crying baby, but from something deeper, older, something that had waited for the right moment to show itself. Elias's cries slowed briefly, interrupted by his own shallow hiccups, then returned, more hoarse now. Adrian gently rocked him again, this time slower, more deliberate, but his eyes never left Marcus. The flight attendant lingered a moment longer, eyes narrowed, then turned and walked away without another word. But even as he moved, his hand brushed the side of his utility pouch. Adrian's eyes locked onto the object peeking out, a roll of duct tape, silver and out of place in a pouch meant for emergency tools and wipes. Why would he need that here? Adrian's heart stuttered. The plane was stable. No repairs, no emergencies. Yet Marcus carried tape like a carpenter on a mission. He could feel the tension building, not just in the air but in his bones. The passengers around him had gone quiet again, lulled into their own discomforts, blind to the storm beginning to swirl in plain sight. He looked down at Elias, whose cries trembled now with fatigue, his eyelids fluttering. Adrian brushed a hand over his son's damp forehead and then glanced back down the aisle. Marcus was speaking to another attendant, but his eyes, cold and predatory, slid back toward them for just a second too long. Adrian turned in his seat, drawing Elias tighter against his chest. His jaw clenched. Whatever was coming, he had no intention of being unprepared. Every warning ignored becomes a regret waiting to happen. Without warning, Marcus lunged forward. Adrian's eyes had been shut for no more than a breath, his body sagging from the exhaustion of rocking his crying son for hours. But the second he heard the rustle of movement, too sharp, too deliberate to be routine, his eyes flew open. It was already too late. Marcus stood over Elias, one hand clamped around the baby's head, the other pressing a thick strip of duct tape across the child's mouth. The silver adhesive swallowed Elias's cries mid-wail, turning them into a suffocated whimper. The sound was awful, wet, panicked, then suddenly quiet. Too quiet. Adrian's heart thudded once, violently, before his body surged into action. He bolted upright, knocking over the tray beside him, and reached for his son. "What are you doing?" he roared, his voice a mixture of panic and rage. Gasps erupted from nearby passengers. A few turned in their seats. One man half rose, then froze. The flight attendants at the front didn't seem to register what had just happened, either too distracted or too far to see. Only Marcus stood still, like a sculpted figure of cold indifference. Adrian clawed at the tape, tearing it off with shaking hands. Elias's small face was pale beneath the cabin lights, his lips already turning a faint shade of blue. The baby's eyes fluttered, then closed. "No, no, 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 stay with me, Elias," Adrian pleaded, tapping the baby's cheeks gently. "Come on, sweetheart, come on." His voice cracked. There was no response, no cry, no breath. The cabin blurred. The lights above turned hazy, streaking across Adrian's vision as panic wrapped around him like a noose. He rocked his son harder, patting his back, willing the air to return to those tiny lungs. But Elias remained limp in his arms. And Marcus? Marcus didn't move. He stood a step away, breathing heavily, his shoulders tense, not with fear, but satisfaction. His expression was unreadable at first, but when Adrian looked up, really looked, he saw it. A smile. Small. Controlled. But there. "You're sick," Adrian breathed, his voice barely audible. His hands clenched around Elias protectively, shielding the child from the man who had just— what? Silenced him. Hurt him. Killed him. Marcus said nothing. He tilted his head slightly, eyes cold, and shrugged as if to say, "What did you expect?" The passengers closest to the scene whispered, paralyzed by disbelief. One man fumbled for his phone but stopped midway, uncertain whether to record or call for help. Another tapped his attendant call button, but no one came. Adrian's mind raced. There had to be oxygen, an emergency kit, something that could help. He twisted around in his seat, scanning desperately. His lips moved, forming silent pleas to no one in particular. "Help me," he finally shouted, voice shaking the cabin. "My son's not breathing." Still, Marcus did nothing. He just watched. And that's when something inside Adrian snapped, not from weakness, but from the unbearable strength of a father's fury. His grief, already raw from the loss of his wife, now mixed with something far more volatile. His hands tightened, his jaw locked. "You hurt my son," Adrian said slowly, each word tasting like iron. "You dared." He stopped himself, not because he didn't know what to say next, but because in that moment he realized what he had to do. Not just for Elias, but for every helpless cry ever ignored, for every moment of cruelty hidden behind a uniform, for the silence that had replaced his son's voice. He looked down again. Elias lay still in his arms, but not gone. Adrian refused to believe it. He could still feel warmth, a thread of life, a spark. It wasn't over, not yet, but the man responsible. He was still here, still breathing, still smiling. Marcus took a step back, sensing something shift in Adrian's posture, but this time it was Adrian who stared, unblinking, unwavering. The tape, the very same roll Marcus had used. It hung from the pouch on Marcus's hip, partially unspooled, glinting under the soft cabin lights like a snake mid-strike. Adrian's eyes locked on it. His hand moved before his mind gave permission. Passengers barely had time to process what they were seeing. One moment, Adrian was seated, cradling his son. The next, he had launched forward, grabbing the tape and shoving Marcus backward into the empty row behind them. Marcus grunted, caught off guard. Adrian didn't stop. With mechanical precision, he tore off a strip and wound it around Marcus's wrists, forcing them against the armrest. "You don't get to move," Adrian hissed. Marcus kicked, struggling, but Adrian was stronger, fueled by terror, rage, and the sheer determination of a father who'd had enough. More tape followed. Across Marcus's arms, his chest, the side of his face. "You want silence." Adrian's voice was low and sharp, each word cutting. "Let me show you what silence feels like." A final strip of tape stretched between Adrian's fists. Passengers leaned in. One even reached for the overhead button. But no one spoke. No one dared intervene. Adrian pressed the tape across Marcus's mouth. The man thrashed wildly. Eyes wide, muffled shouts escaping beneath the silver seal, but it was too late. The predator had been bound. Adrian stepped back, holding Elias close once more. He was breathing faster now, each inhale shallow, erratic. But he was breathing. That was all that mattered. Everything else could burn. The silence of a child became the loudest cry of war. Marcus stepped forward again. Adrian barely registered the movement. His world had narrowed to the limp weight of Elias in his arms, to the ghostly pallor of his son's face. But the moment Marcus moved, something inside Adrian cracked. A line snapped, quiet and final, like the edge of a blade breaking free from its sheath. Rage flooded his veins, not the hot kind that burned recklessly, but the cold, precise fury of a man who had just witnessed something sacred being violated. "No," Adrian growled under his breath, his voice low but laced with threat. Marcus didn't flinch. If anything, he smirked, as if daring Adrian to do something. That smirk, casual, cruel, devoid of remorse, was the final spark. Adrian stood. With one arm he cradled Elias close, the child's head resting against his chest like a broken wing. With the other he reached down and snatched the strip of duct tape that Marcus had dropped, its silver gleam catching the dim cabin lights. Passengers gasped. Some shouted. A man across the aisle rose from his seat in confusion, but no one dared move. "Sit down," someone barked, a male voice, frightened and high-pitched. But it was too late. Adrian was already in motion. He lunged forward, forcing Marcus backward with a shove so powerful that the flight attendant stumbled into an empty seat and crashed down hard. The thud echoed like a hammer strike in the narrow aisle. Marcus tried to rise, but Adrian was faster. He dropped Elias gently into the lap of a shocked passenger beside him, an older man with trembling hands, and turned back to face the predator. "I'm done watching," Adrian said through clenched teeth. The cabin spun in silence, every breath held, every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Adrian grabbed Marcus's wrists and shoved them against the armrests. The man thrashed, snarling like a beast caught in a trap. "Get off me," Marcus spat, veins bulging at his temple, face reddening. But Adrian wasn't listening. He was already tearing off lengths of duct tape, his movements methodical, mechanical. He wrapped Marcus's wrist to the seat with the cold precision of a craftsman. Tight, efficient loops, over and over until the skin beneath the tape began to bulge. "You think you can hurt my son and walk away?" Adrian whispered, his breath shaking not from fear, but fury. Marcus bucked against the restraints, but Adrian slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him. His strength wasn't just physical, it was grief turned into purpose, a storm channeled through action. The passengers nearby flinched but didn't interfere. Even the crew remained frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths half open. Adrian reached for another strip of tape. "No!" Marcus cried, a hint of fear finally breaking through his voice. "You're making a mistake." Adrian didn't answer. He grabbed the man's jaw and forced it shut with one hand, then pressed the duct tape across his face. One long strip at first, then another, tighter, sealing his mouth shut. Marcus's muffled protests became more desperate, more animalistic, but Adrian didn't stop. He rapped again, and again. Each pass of tape was a sentence, a judgment, a declaration. "You silenced my son," Adrian said, his voice trembling with restraint. "Now feel what you made him feel." The sound of tearing tape echoed louder than the engines. One of the younger crew members, a tall man in a black vest, moved hesitantly toward them. "Sir, please, that's enough." Adrian turned to him slowly, eyes dark, shoulders heaving. "He taped my son's mouth shut," he said, nodding toward Elias, who still lay motionless in the arms of the man 2 rows back. He stopped breathing. The crew members' steps faltered. Gasps rose from a few passengers as the implications landed. One man pressed a hand to his mouth. Another closed his eyes, whispering a prayer. No one moved to help Marcus. Not anymore. Adrian stood over him now, taller, fiercer, transformed. His shirt was wrinkled, damp with sweat. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. Duct tape hung from one hand like a flag of revolt. Marcus stared up at him, his eyes wide, frantic, begging, but silent. The roles had reversed. Adrian looked down at him, breathing through clenched teeth. Marcus was no longer a threat. He was a warning, a symbol, the embodiment of every unseen cruelty that had ever slipped past justice. But not this time, not this father, not this flight. The lights above flickered slightly as turbulence rocked the cabin, but the mood inside had already shifted. The fear that had once centered around Adrian was now replaced with something else, understanding, maybe even awe. In that moment, Adrian was not just a grieving father, he was the hand of consequence. And when he stepped back, watching Marcus twitch in his bindings, the duct tape across his face gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a hush fell over the plane. The balance of power had shifted. Adrian was no longer just a grieving father, he was the executioner. The same silence Marcus had forced upon the child now came for him. Marcus thrashed violently against the seat, his body convulsing in jerky, desperate movements. His wrists were bound tight with duct tape, the same silver coil he had once wielded like a tool of control, now holding him prisoner. The tape across his mouth stretched with every muffled cry, the sound a low, choking moan that echoed through the cabin like a haunted whisper. Adrian Vaylor stood in front of him, his chest heaving, eyes narrowed, not in confusion, not in fear, but in something sharper, colder. Purpose. The air inside the aircraft had shifted. It was no longer just pressurized, it was charged, thick with silence, tension, and disbelief. Every seat held a witness. Some passengers clutched the armrest so tightly their knuckles had gone pale. Others sat frozen, mouths ajar, eyes flicking between Adrian and Marcus as if unsure which of the two men posed the greater danger. A teenage boy near the aisle instinctively reached for his phone, but his hand froze mid-air, too afraid to move. Adrian's grip tightened on the tape that ran around Marcus's chest and shoulders. His hands moved with precision, not panic. With each pull of the tape, he was reclaiming something that had been stolen, the safety of his son, the sanctity of fatherhood, the trust that cruelty would be punished and not ignored. "You thought no one would stop you," Adrian said quietly, almost to himself. His voice wasn't raised, yet it pierced the stunned quiet like a scalpel. His hands were steady, eyes locked on Marcus's flailing face. "You thought this was your sky, your cabin, your rules." Marcus jerked his head, the muscles in his neck straining as he tried to speak through the layers of tape. His nostrils flared, eyes wide with disbelief and growing panic. But Adrian didn't blink. The image of Elias, still and breathless moments ago, was carved into his mind, fueling every movement like oil on fire. From the cockpit, the captain's voice did not come. There was only the mechanical hum of flight, the muffled clicks of people shifting in their seats, and the low buzz of someone whispering a prayer from the front row. A balding man with glasses leaned forward, murmuring, "God help us," as if afraid even those words might provoke something worse. Behind Adrian, a younger male flight attendant, barely out of training by the look of him, stood paralyzed. He wore a blue vest that was slightly too big, his ID tag dangling askew. He had witnessed Marcus's earlier actions but said nothing. Now, faced with the reversal of power, he trembled, uncertain whether to step in or stay still. His mouth opened, then shut again. Adrian didn't need help. Not anymore. He stepped even closer to Marcus, their faces inches apart now. "I asked for peace," Adrian said slowly. "You brought war." He tore off a new strip of duct tape with one hard pull, the sound sharp and final. Marcus squirmed harder, but Adrian wrapped the tape across his shoulders over the chest, anchoring him tighter into the seat. With each wrap, Marcus's movements weakened, his protests muffled and breathless. There was no joy in Adrian's face, only fire, steady and righteous. Someone toward the rear muttered, "This is going too far." But another voice, calm and firm, countered, "He saved his son." "Wouldn't you do the same?" That second voice belonged to a man in a brown leather jacket, seated just behind Adrian. He sat straight-backed, arms crossed, his eyes unwavering. He wasn't afraid. He was watching closely, calculating, perhaps even respecting Adrian's control. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Just minutes ago, Marcus had walked these aisles with unchecked power. He had been the enforcer, the figure behind the uniform who expected submission. Now, stripped of control, eyes wide and desperate, he was made to feel every second of the fear he had once inflicted. Adrian leaned down again, one hand gripping Marcus's shoulder tightly. "You wanted silence," he whispered, his voice like steel. "Feel it." The final strip of tape went across Marcus's mouth once more, tight, deliberate, and unflinching. Marcus jerked once, twice, then slumped slightly, his breathing shallow beneath the layers. The silver shine of the tape caught the low cabin light, turning him into something else entirely. A symbol, a warning, a mirror of the violence he had once delivered without thought. Passengers sat in stunned quiet. The air smelled faintly of sweat, metal, and fear. A man, somewhere toward the back, whispered into his phone, unaware he was even recording. Another wiped tears from his eyes, whether from fear or empathy, no one could tell. Adrian stood straight, his chest rising and falling. His eyes scanned the cabin, not looking for threats, but for witnesses. Every man in that plane had just seen what happened when a predator crossed a father. Adrian didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken for him. The predator had become prey, and justice wrapped itself in silver strands of tape. Adrian had just tightened the final strip of duct tape across Marcus's face when a voice behind him barked, "That's enough. Step away from him, now." A firm grip clamped down on Adrian's arm, yanking him backward with more force than he expected. Instinctively, he turned and shoved, his free hand landing squarely against the chest of a man in uniform, one of the senior flight attendants, tall, red-faced, and visibly trembling. The man stumbled back a few steps, shock painted across his features. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from a passenger holding a child. Gasps rippled through the cabin, louder than the aircraft's humming engines. Adrian stood his ground, chest heaving, his body shielding Elias, who whimpered softly in his arms. "Stay back," Adrian said, his voice rough with emotion but steady. "He tried to kill my son." "He's not a victim." The senior attendant raised his hands in a pacifying gesture, but his voice was shrill with panic. "You don't get to decide that. You can't just assault a crew member mid-flight. There are protocols." "Protocols?" Adrian snapped, eyes blazing. He taped a child's mouth shut until he stopped breathing. Where were your protocols then? The tension between the two men crackled like static in the air. Some passengers leaned away, clutching their armrests, unsure of who was right. Others watched with silent nods, their loyalty shifting toward Adrian, even if their fear kept them still. The scene teetered dangerously, order on the verge of collapse. For a moment, Adrian thought the attendant might try again. His stance shifted, legs tensed, arms hovering at his sides like a boxer unsure of the next punch. Adrian adjusted Elias in his grip, planting his feet more firmly. He was ready to fight if he had to. But then, cutting through the confusion, came another voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, calm, intentional. Let him be. Heads turned toward the speaker. A man stood several rows back, slowly rising from his seat. He wore a long gray coat that brushed the tops of his shoes, and his demeanor was quiet, almost eerie in its calmness. He held up a small handheld camera, recording light still blinking red. The man's voice, though not shouted, carried through the cabin with an authority that silenced the room. My name is Damon Crow. I've been filming since the moment that man. He pointed at Marcus's duct-taped face. Pressed tape over that baby's mouth. This camera has it all. Every second gasps broke out again, this time tinged with something new. Realization. Several passengers turned toward Adrian with renewed understanding, their hesitation giving way to empathy. Damon stepped into the aisle, his expression grave but steady. This man didn't attack first. He acted when no one else did. You want the truth? I've got it right here. The senior attendant looked at Damon, then back at Adrian. His mouth opened, then shut again. The power dynamics in the cabin shifted like tectonic plates. For the first time since the plane had lifted into the stormy sky, Adrian didn't feel alone. Adrian's chest tightened, not with fear this time, but something else, something like hope. The camera was more than evidence. It was armor, a witness no one could silence. He looked at Damon and gave a small nod. Thank you, he said, voice nearly lost in the cabin's hum. Damon returned the nod. Don't thank me yet. The world outside is still waiting to spin this story into whatever sells, but they can't twist what they can't deny. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, not in fear, but in support. One man spoke up. I saw it too. He did the right thing. Another added, that baby would have died if he hadn't stepped in. For a brief moment, unity bloomed inside that cabin. Not everyone agreed, but the weight of the truth had shifted the tide. Adrian looked down at Elias, whose breathing had steadied into shallow but rhythmic inhales. His son, still fragile, still pale, but alive. The image of Marcus's smirk, the sight of that silver tape, the silence that had followed, it all burned in his memory. But now, with Damon's footage and the voices rising around him, Adrian's resolve hardened. He would not run from what he had done. He would not apologize for protecting his son. The aircraft still cruised through the clouds, but inside the cabin, the storm was no longer his alone. Foreshadowing stirred like distant thunder. This recording, this truth caught on tape, would not remain confined to one plane. It would shatter lies, rewrite narratives, and draw battle lines in the courtrooms and screens that awaited below. When lies try to scream, truth finds its lens. He thought cruelty could be buried under silence, but justice always finds a voice. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Adrian pressed the final strip of duct tape across Marcus's mouth, his hands shaking from the surge of adrenaline still coursing through him. The man beneath his grip no longer thrashed. The fight had drained from Marcus's limbs, leaving only shallow, ragged breaths escaping through his nose. Around them, the cabin held its breath. The stillness wasn't peace. It was the quiet before understanding settled into the bones of every passenger. Then, a sound pierced the silence. Faint, fragile. Cough! It came again, soft, shallow, unmistakably real. Adrian's head snapped downward. Elias stirred in his arms, a tiny hand twitching against his father's chest. The baby's lips parted slightly, a rasping breath escaping as his chest rose with effort. A wet, breathless cough followed, barely audible but impossibly loud to Adrian's ears. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then the full weight of it hit him. Elias was alive. Adrian dropped to his knees in the narrow aisle, clutching his son as if the act alone might anchor him to this world. His chest heaved with sobs he no longer tried to hide. Tears poured from his eyes and dripped onto the child's blanket as he cradled Elias closer, whispering in broken fragments. "Stay with me. I've got you. You're safe now." Passengers gasped, the tension breaking in a wave across the cabin. A few clapped hands over their mouths. Others shut their eyes, silently grateful they hadn't just witnessed a tragedy. Yet, despite the flood of relief, no one moved closer. The air still trembled with uncertainty. Adrian glanced up. Marcus, slumped in the seat, was barely conscious. His chest rose and fell weakly beneath the tight bands of silver tape. His eyes were wide and unblinking, locked somewhere between defiance and fear. Every ounce of smug control he had worn earlier had dissolved into silence and sweat. He looked less like a man and more like a collapsed threat, something once sharp and snarling, now dulled by its own venom. Adrian stood, arms tightening protectively around Elias. His expression had changed. The wild, searing fury that had once contorted his face had settled into something colder, clearer. Not rage, but resolution. But even as he stood there, breathing hard, heart hammering, a new worry began to bloom. What would they say now? He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some filled with sympathy, others with quiet judgment. He had saved his son, yes, but had he gone too far? Would the world understand that this wasn't blind revenge? It had been desperation, sharpened by the scream of a child going silent? He turned slowly, scanning the cabin. Several passengers looked away. One man near the back nodded, offering quiet support. Another, closer to the front, kept his phone pressed low, still recording. Adrian didn't know whether to feel comforted or trapped by that lens. His thoughts spiraled. The cameras, the aftermath, the headlines. Would they see him as a monster, a threat? Would they care that Elias had nearly died? A low groan came from Marcus's throat, muffled beneath the tape. Adrian's stare locked onto him again. Number. This man didn't deserve pity. He had walked the aisle like a fuse, waiting for ignition. He had watched a child suffer and taken it as personal offense. He had acted not in stress, but in intent. That tape wasn't madness. It had been a choice. Adrian shifted Elias in his arms, feeling the child's shallow breaths against his neck. With trembling fingers he kissed the boy's forehead. "You're safe," he whispered again, voice rough from emotion. "I promise. No one will hurt you again." Around him, murmurs began to spread. Passengers whispered to each other, heads leaned close. Some argued, others watched in silence. The plane, once a place of quiet tension, had become a courtroom of its own. A man near row 9 finally spoke. Is the baby okay?" Adrian didn't respond with words. He simply nodded once, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. He took one last look at Marcus, who now sagged against the headrest like a discarded threat, eyes fluttering between awareness and defeat. A faint voice spoke from behind Adrian. "Sir, the cockpit wants to know if the situation's under control." It was one of the younger attendants. Nervous, pale, male. Adrian didn't turn. "It is now," he said, each word measured, his tone steel. And though the storm had momentarily passed, the air remained thick with questions. Unspoken fears drifted between seats, lingering like smoke from a fire not yet extinguished. Everyone had seen what happened, but not all would agree on what it meant. Outside the windows, night still ruled the sky, stars buried beneath layers of cloud and altitude. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. A man had been broken, a child nearly lost, and a father transformed into something neither hero nor villain. Only one truth pulsed clearly in Adrian's mind as he rocked his son gently in the dim light. Hope flickered like a candle in the storm, but the fire of vengeance was not yet done burning. The captain's voice broke the heavy silence like a whip through air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing. Please remain calm and stay seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement hung in the cabin like fog, thick, unsettling, impossible to ignore. A hush fell, broken only by the occasional rustle of a seatbelt being clicked tighter or the nervous tap of fingers against armrests. But no one looked toward the front. All eyes, every single one, were fixed on Adrian Vaylor. He stood unmoving, Elias clutched protectively against his chest, his other hand still gripping the roll of silver duct tape like a weapon made from grief. Marcus Wren sat bound in his seat across the aisle, his head slumped, chest heaving in short, muffled breaths. The tape wrapped across his face gleamed under the overhead lights, catching every flicker of movement like the sheen of a blade. A whisper cut through the tension. "That man saved his baby," said a passenger near the back. "He might have saved all of us," another added cautiously. But not everyone nodded in agreement. Some looked pale, eyes darting between the restrained attendant and Adrian as if unsure who the real threat was. Adrian's jaw was clenched, but his mind was spinning faster than the engines outside the cabin. He knew exactly what would be waiting on the ground: uniformed officers, flashing lights, judgment passed in headlines before a single question was asked. They would see duct tape. They would see a crew member subdued. And if they didn't believe what happened, if they only saw the surface, he could lose everything. Damon Crow's voice cut through the murmurs. "I have everything recorded," he said loudly, holding up the small camera. "Start to finish. They need to see what happened, not just what it looks like now." Adrian turned slightly toward him, nodding once. That footage was his lifeline now, the only chance he had of flipping the narrative before it devoured him. Then, out of nowhere, another voice rose. It was shaky but urgent, coming from a man seated 2 rows ahead. His name was Harold Maddox, a balding man with thin glasses and a fidgety manner who had barely spoken the entire flight. I think he was messing with my bag," Harold said, his voice cracking. "Earlier. Before all this, Marcus. He crouched near the overhead bin and I thought it was just routine. But now I'm not so sure." Adrian's head turned sharply. "What did he do to your bag?" he asked, the words low but edged with steel. "I don't know," Harold stammered. "He looked weird. Focused. Like he didn't want anyone to see him." Adrian's pulse quickened. "Open it," he said, stepping closer. "Now." The passengers fell silent again. Harold hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached into the overhead bin. His fingers trembled as he unzipped the side pocket. The sound of the zipper echoed louder than it should have in the tense stillness. He pulled out a small metal container, sleek, unlabeled, the kind that could be overlooked unless you knew to look for it. Adrian took it gently, popped it open. Inside were rows of pale blue pills, dozens of them. The reaction was instant. Gasps swept through the cabin like a gust of wind. A woman in the back stifled a cry. A man in business attire muttered something under his breath. Even Damon took a step closer, his camera lowering for the first time. Adrian's grip tightened around Elias, who shifted faintly in his arms, stirring from a brief unconsciousness. The child's breath was slow but steady, still alive. But what if Marcus had succeeded in drugging the cabin? What if Elias had been the first to suffer while the rest would have followed? "This wasn't impulse," Adrian said, turning to face the stunned crowd. His voice was quiet but filled with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. "He didn't just snap. He planned this." A murmur of agreement rumbled around the seats. The realization hit hard. Marcus wasn't just a cruel man. He was a threat to everyone on board. "You think he was going to use those pills on passengers?" someone asked. "He had duct tape." "Sedatives. And a history no one bothered to check," Adrian replied. "How many of us were supposed to fall asleep and not wake up?" Silence. Damon slowly raised his camera again. "The world needs to hear that too," he said. "All of it." Adrian nodded. But inside, the storm hadn't passed. It had just changed form. He knew this was bigger now. Bigger than him. Bigger than even Elias. This was about a system that had allowed Marcus to reach that aisle in the first place. And the moment they landed, the system would try to protect itself. He looked at the container in his hand. Cold. Full of something unseen but dangerous. Marcus shifted slightly in his restraints, eyes fluttering open. There was no longer arrogance in them, only fear. Adrian held his stare for a long moment. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. "You came for my son. You nearly took everything. Now the world will see what you are." As the engines began to roar louder, signaling the descent, the seatbelt signs blinked on. Adrian sat down, securing Elias across his lap with the infant oxygen mask ready in reach. He kept his eyes forward, his breathing steady. Outside, the lights of the emergency vehicles began to flicker into view through the small windows. No one spoke, not even Marcus. The cabin had become a courtroom, and soon the doors would open to judgment. Evil is never an accident. It is often a plan waiting to unfold. The moment the plastic container of pills hit the floor and rolled near a passenger's feet, a chill swept through the cabin like a gust of wind through a cracked window. The label was missing, but the contents were unmistakable. Rows of round, pale sedatives stacked tightly in small compartments. A gasp rippled down the aisle as the man who had opened the bag took a shaky step backward, his hands trembling. "These weren't mine," he said, voice cracking. "He put them in there. I saw him do it." I thought it was a mistake." Adrian turned toward the passenger, eyes narrowing as he scanned the evidence. The man's face was pale, sweat lining his temples, but his words rang with sincerity. Adrian looked down at Elias, whose tiny breaths had steadied, though his body remained curled limply in his father's arms. Then he looked back at Marcus, who sat gagged and bound, glaring through watery, furious eyes. The duct tape stretched tight across his face was now damp with sweat, and his chest rose and fell in short, angry bursts. The cabin was no longer simply a vessel in the sky, it had become a court. Every man in the aisle was a witness, every whisper a verdict forming. Passengers leaned in close to one another, debating what to believe. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others pointed accusing fingers at Marcus, and a few, despite everything they'd seen, questioned Adrian's authority to take justice into his own hands. A man in business attire stood up from the aisle seat, gripping the overhead compartment to steady himself. "We need to tell the captain. This is beyond any of us now," he said. Adrian stepped forward, positioning himself between the crowd and Marcus. "He didn't act out of stress," Adrian said, voice clear and strong. "He came with these pills. This wasn't an outburst, it was a plan." His voice carried, low but forceful, silencing the murmurs. The flickering ceiling lights cast long shadows across the walls, exaggerating the drama of every face, every movement. The engines hummed beneath their feet, a constant reminder that they were still suspended thousands of feet in the air. Together, in a pressurized moment, none of them could escape. Damon Crowe lifted his camera once more, angling it toward Adrian. "Keep talking," he urged softly. "Let the world see this." Adrian nodded, not to Damon, but to everyone. "He didn't just silence my son. He could have silenced all of us. How many of these would it take to knock out a cabin full of men? What happens if I hadn't stopped him? If my son hadn't cried? Would we have all woken up strapped to our seats? Or not woken up at all?" A sharp intake of breath echoed from the rear. A flight attendant, young, nervous, stepped from behind the curtain. I saw Marcus near the crew station earlier. He was messing with something in the beverage cart drawer. I didn't say anything because I thought he was reorganizing supplies, but now I'm not sure." Adrian turned his gaze on the young man. "Did he put anything in there?" The attendant hesitated. I don't know. Maybe. I was helping with a seatbelt issue in row 6, but I remember the drawer was open, and he looked distracted. Not angry, not rushed, just focused." Whispers grew louder. The murmurs were no longer about fear of Adrian. They were now about the possibility that Marcus had planned something darker, something far more dangerous than a moment of cruelty. The idea rooted itself in the minds of the passengers like a spreading vine. Adrian looked at Marcus, who now struggled harder against the tape, muffled growls escaping as he kicked against the seat base. But it wasn't fury anymore. It was panic. His eyes were wide, wild, darting to the bag of pills, to the faces turning against him. "He was going to drug us," someone muttered from the front. "No, not drug. Disable," another man corrected grimly. "That explains the attitude." He was waiting for a trigger. Elias crying. "That messed up his timeline," said the businessman from earlier, now sitting back down slowly. Adrian remained standing, a calm fire in his eyes. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't about noise, it wasn't about protocol. It was about power and control. The humming of the engines shifted. The plane had begun its descent. Overhead lights blinked with a soft chime as the seatbelt signs turned on. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, tense but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are preparing for an unscheduled emergency landing. I need everyone to remain seated and calm. Cabin crew, take your seats immediately." The command anchored the moment. Passengers obeyed without protest. Tension hung thick in the air as seatbacks creaked and belts clicked into place. The descent had begun, but no one felt relief. The ground below didn't promise safety. It promised interrogation, flashing lights, and the judgment of people who hadn't lived through this flight. Adrian sat slowly, keeping Elias nestled against him, his eyes locked on Marcus one last time before closing them briefly in a breath of preparation. Damon, still filming, whispered, "They're going to come for you, you know. Even with the footage. You broke protocol." "I didn't come here to follow protocol," Adrian murmured, his voice soft but unshaken. "I came here to protect my son." The weight of that statement settled over Damon. He lowered the camera just slightly, then raised it again with renewed resolve. From his corner, Marcus sat hunched, the silver tape reflecting the dim lights, his body slumped and still. His presence no longer felt dominant. It felt pitiful. Hollow. The storm he'd tried to summon had turned on him. Outside, the night sky gave way to specks of light below. The runway loomed ahead. Sirens flickered in the distance, already converging. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. The roar of descent replaced the earlier cries. Even fear felt suspended in the air. And above it all, Adrian sat unmoving, jaw clenched, gaze focused straight ahead. As the plane fell toward the runway, so too did judgment fall upon every man inside. The tires struck the runway with a violent jolt, sending a shudder through the metal bones of the plane. Screeches of rubber on asphalt filled the cabin as emergency vehicles with flashing lights sped alongside, their red and blue beams slicing through the night outside the windows. Inside, passengers clutched their armrests, breath held not from the turbulence, but from the storm that had already torn through the cabin at 30,000 feet. Adrian Vaylor did not flinch. His arms cradled Elias tightly against his chest, the child's breath still shallow, his warmth a fragile lifeline. Adrian's eyes stayed fixed on the front of the cabin. He didn't blink as the aircraft finally slowed, the engines roaring down to a tense hum. The moment the plane halted, the front doors burst open with a metallic hiss. A rush of cold night air swept inside, chased by the pounding of boots. Uniformed officers stormed into the aisle with sharp commands and raised arms. "Hands where we can see them," one barked. "Everyone remain seated," another shouted, sweeping the aisle with wary eyes. Passengers froze mid-motion, some lifting trembling hands, others shielding their eyes from the sudden glare of flashlights. The lead officer's gaze moved swiftly, landing first on Marcus Wren, bound and slumped in his seat with layers of silver duct tape across his chest, wrists, and face. Then, his eyes locked on Adrian. Adrian stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. Elias stirred faintly in his arms, whimpering, and Adrian lowered his voice in a whisper meant only for his son. "We're almost through, little one. Just a little more." The officers hesitated, their training wrestling with what they were seeing. A man standing upright, calm, cradling a baby. A flight attendant silenced and restrained, yet wearing a uniform that usually signified authority. Who was the threat here? One of the officers moved forward, hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Sir, place the child down and step away." Adrian didn't budge. His voice was low, but unshaken. "He's injured." "I won't put him down. Now, sir." "We don't want—" "He saved us," came a sudden voice from behind the officers. All heads turned as Damon Crowe stepped into the aisle, his gray coat open, his arm raised high, holding the small camera that had captured the entire ordeal. His voice was louder now, firmer. "He's not the threat." The man tied to the seat as another officer glanced toward Damon, who pressed a button on the side of the device. The tiny screen lit up, showing flickers of the recording. A few seconds played, Marcus forcing the tape over Elias's mouth, Adrian ripping it away, the child's limp body, the passengers screaming. A silence fell. One of the senior officers leaned closer to inspect the footage, his expression hardening as he processed the evidence. He looked back toward Marcus, whose eyes were half-lidded behind the crisscross of duct tape. His face had gone pale. The last remnants of defiance drained into something eerily blank. "Get him out," the officer ordered. Two younger officers moved to Marcus's side. They hesitated only a moment before pulling him from the seat, the tape still clinging to his clothes. His body was heavy, like a man finally weighed down by the truth. He grunted weakly behind the adhesive seal, but no one responded, not with sympathy, not with words. Adrian exhaled sharply as the focus shifted away from him, but he wasn't foolish enough to believe the danger had passed. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, did not slow easily. He expected cuffs, or at the very least, detainment. Instead, another officer approached him, hand still resting on his hip, voice measured. "Is the child okay?" "He's alive," Adrian replied, "but he needs medical attention immediately." The officer nodded and stepped aside, radioing for a medical team. Through the open hatch, Adrian could see flashing lights reflected off the tarmac. A team was already rushing toward the steps. Around him, the cabin remained eerily quiet. No one moved, no one dared speak out of turn. Is it over?" someone whispered behind him. No one answered. Adrian turned briefly to the other passengers. Some looked away. Some gave him brief nods of solidarity. A few stared, haunted by what they had just witnessed. One man, middle-aged, with thinning hair and a trembling hand, raised his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Adrian gave a slight nod, but said nothing. As he turned back toward the exit, the officers stepped aside, creating a narrow corridor down the center of the plane. Adrian walked slowly through it, his shoes tapping against the floor in rhythm with his racing thoughts. Elias shifted in his arms, letting out a faint cough. Adrian's chest tightened. At the base of the steps, paramedics waited. One reached up, carefully taking Elias with gloved hands as Adrian followed close behind, heart in his throat. Behind him, cameras flashed, journalists and onlookers already gathering at the security perimeter. Adrian ignored them all. From the cabin above, officers continued filing out, escorting Marcus's restrained form into a separate vehicle, sirens blaring in the background. Adrian didn't look back. His thoughts were ahead, on the hospital, on the questions he'd soon be asked, on the twisted web of truth and spin that would follow. But for now, only one thing mattered. Elias had survived, and so had he. The truth does not always walk off the plane in handcuffs. It sometimes walks off carrying a child. The terminal exploded into a frenzy the moment the cabin doors swung open. Flashing cameras lit the walkway like a lightning storm. Reporters swarmed from all directions, microphones thrust forward like spears, shouting questions before Adrian had even taken a full step onto the jet bridge. Uniformed agents flanked the aircraft's exit, trying to maintain order, but the media had already caught wind of what happened on board, half rumor, half firestorm. "Did you attack the flight attendant?" one man barked. "Was it premeditated?" another shouted. Adrian said nothing. His arms clutched Elias tighter, the boy's body still limp but no longer deathly cold. The medical team, already briefed, approached quickly. "Sir, we have to take the child," one paramedic urged, a young man whose voice tried to stay calm amid the chaos. Adrian hesitated. His eyes narrowed at the stretcher, the monitors, the unfamiliar hands. Every part of his being screamed not to let go. But Elias let out a faint groan, his eyelids fluttering, and Adrian knew he had no choice. "Go with him," he whispered to one of the security personnel. "Don't let him out of your sight." The medic nodded and wheeled Elias away, disappearing into the sea of flashing bulbs and blaring voices. Adrian stood frozen for a beat, his hands now empty, his heart twice as heavy. Behind him, another group of officers emerged from the plane, escorting Marcus Wren, bound, taped, and barely conscious. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they caught sight of the flight attendant's swollen, distorted face, still streaked with adhesive. Reporters fell silent for a breath. Then the murmurs rose again. Phones rose like a synchronized wave. "Was that really necessary?" one whispered. "Did the CEO do that himself?" But Marcus's muffled protests were weak, swallowed by the sound of cameras and commotion. Whatever he tried to say was meaningless now. The weight of the footage, Damon's recording, the passengers' testimonies, the sedatives found in the carry-on, had already painted him as more than a rogue attendant. He was a predator whose intentions reached beyond irritation. Still, the narrative was slipping. Already, Adrian could hear twisted versions of the story circulating among the crowd. Words like assault, overreaction, and unhinged executive floated through the air like poison. A reporter near the barricade turned to his cameraman and muttered, "We need that footage." Before the lawyers sanitize it, another nodded toward Adrian. "He doesn't look like a hero. He looks dangerous." Adrian clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the terminal, searching for Damon. There, at the edge of the crowd, the man in the gray coat stood firm, his small camera still in hand, now securely cased and strapped across his chest. Damon met Adrian's gaze and gave a single nod. The footage was safe. For now. A tall man in a black suit approached, Agent Kyle Mercer, Homeland Security Liaison at the airport. His voice was low but urgent. "Mr. Valor, we need to move you to a secure area. There are too many variables out here." I'm not answering questions, Adrian said flatly, his tone sharp. You don't have to, Mercer replied, but if you want control of the story, you'll need to act fast. They're already spinning it out of your hands. Adrian glanced once more at the disappearing gurney carrying Elias. The ache in his chest deepened. Where are they taking him? Regional Medical Bay. He's stable. They're running a full panel now. Adrian gave a slow nod, trying to keep his thoughts from unraveling. He followed Mercer through a back corridor, the sounds of the terminal fading behind him. Each step felt heavier, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what was coming. Inside the security office, a wall of monitors flickered with surveillance feeds. Agents spoke into radios, scanning crowd reactions and updating legal teams. A young officer offered Adrian water, which he declined. Another handed him a printed transcript of preliminary witness accounts. Sir, one of the aides said, media outlets are already speculating you used excessive force. There's no official statement from your side yet. There won't be, Adrian replied. Then they'll write it for you. He didn't respond. The tension in his shoulders hardened into stone. Outside the glass, Marcus was being loaded into a separate vehicle, his hands finally freed so paramedics could monitor his condition. But the damage was already done. The footage of Adrian wrapping duct tape across his face would go viral within hours, stripped of context, detached from Elias's fading cries and the sheer terror that had gripped every row on that plane. That image of a CEO silencing a flight attendant would become the centerpiece of every headline, regardless of the truth. Mercer stood beside him, arms folded. You've got about 12 hours before public opinion picks a side. Make sure they pick the right one. Adrian turned his gaze to the monitor showing the gate area, where passengers were now disembarking, giving statements to investigators, some already pulled aside by reporters. The camera zoomed in on one man holding up a smartphone. The screen paused on the moment Marcus lunged with the tape. Adrian recognized the man. He had shouted during the incident, demanded action. Now he was offering the evidence to anyone willing to listen. There was hope. But it was a fragile, shifting thing. The door opened again. A junior agent entered with a flash drive in hand. Copy of the plane footage. Cameras caught parts of the confrontation near the galley. Not the whole thing, but enough. Adrian looked at the drive, then at Mercer. Then it begins. He stepped away from the table, rolling his sleeves to his elbows, jaw clenched tight as the first wave of press releases began circulating on the screens. Adrian Vaylor. Out of control. CEO or vigilante. Mid-air justice or corporate breakdown. He turned his back to them all. He had saved his son. He had exposed a predator. And yet the world was already being told he was the monster. Somewhere out there, Elias was breathing. That was all that mattered. But Adrian knew this battle was far from over. Some wars are not fought with fists or tape, but with words sharper than any blade. Adrian Vaylor sat motionless in the cold interview room, his hands folded tightly on the steel table. The air was thick with tension, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh glare that made every corner of the room feel exposed. Behind the one-way mirror, he could feel the invisible eyes watching, judging, recording every breath, every blink, every pause. He didn't bother looking at his own reflection anymore. He had memorized it, his face pale from exhaustion, the shadows under his eyes darker than the bruises on his knuckles. Two men in charcoal suits stood across from him, their tone clinical, practiced. One of them, a district attorney named Coleman Rusk, leaned forward with his hands flat on the table. "Did you intend to kill him?" he asked, his voice steady, eyes searching. Adrian met the question without blinking. "No," he said quietly. "I intended to stop him." The second lawyer, a younger man with slicked back hair and a silver watch that gleamed with every gesture, flipped through a thick file of notes. "You wrapped duct tape over a man's mouth and nose, Mr. Vaylor. You immobilized him, restrained him. Some would say you escalated the situation. That's not self-defense, it's retaliation." Adrian's jaw tightened. He glanced at the mirror, knowing someone important stood just beyond it. "He duct-taped my infant son's mouth. My son stopped breathing. I did what any father would do." Coleman's expression flickered, just for a moment, but he didn't let it show for long. "You were the aggressor after that point." "Was I?" Adrian replied, his voice sharper now, rising like a blade unsheathed. "He wasn't done. He had more. He planned more." There was a beat of silence. The younger lawyer shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering the footage, because Damon's video, now a global sensation, had changed everything. It had shattered the neat, one-sided narrative that prosecutors had hoped to build. No longer was Adrian simply a vigilante CEO losing control in the skies. The footage showed Marcus Wren pinning a child's cries with malicious glee and Adrian moving not in rage, but desperation. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred, but not broken. And yet, the prosecution remained determined. The law, they argued, was not shaped by emotions, no matter how compelling the footage. They needed precedent. They needed to show the public that no man, no matter how powerful or broken, could take the law into his own hands. Adrian leaned back in his chair, breathing through his nose to keep the growing frustration from slipping into fury. "You want a headline," he said, "not justice. You think you're above the law because you're a CEO?" the younger lawyer snapped. Adrian's eyes locked on him like steel on glass. "No, I think I'm a father who had no choice." The door opened suddenly, and another man stepped in, a federal investigator in a dark blue jacket. He carried a folder that looked worn and heavy, and his eyes scanned the room before settling on Coleman. He gave a short nod, then looked at Adrian. "You might want to hear this," the agent said, placing the folder on the table. He flipped it open, revealing complaint forms, internal emails, maintenance logs. Marcus Wren wasn't just a bad apple. He was a time bomb. The room shifted. Coleman reached for the papers while the other lawyer hovered, their confident posture now uncertain. The agent continued. "We got a call yesterday. Anonymous tip from someone in ground operations. Turns out Wren had been reported 6 times in the last 3 years. Excessive force, verbal abuse, even an incident where he nearly caused a mid-air panic by locking a service animal in a supply closet. The airline buried the reports. Management didn't want another scandal." Adrian's throat tightened. He had suspected something deeper, but now it was confirmed. Wren hadn't just snapped that day. He had been protected, encouraged even. "Who made the call?" Adrian asked. "A mechanic." Man named Bryce Healy. Said he couldn't keep quiet anymore. Saw Wren loading something strange onto the beverage cart days before your flight. Reported it. Got ignored. The prosecutor's face turned grim as he flipped through the contents. The internal memos were damning, HR redacted complaints, maintenance heads noting erratic behavior, supervisors signing off on resolved issues with no action taken. "Why wasn't this turned over earlier?" the younger lawyer muttered. "Because someone at the top told them not to," the agent replied. "We're investigating that too." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft buzz of the overhead lights. Adrian finally exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was resolution. "This was never about me," he said quietly. "It was about how many people saw a fire starting and looked away." "I didn't." Coleman rose slowly, the weight of the new evidence clearly sinking in. "We'll need time to reassess," he said, voice low. As the lawyers filed out, the agent lingered. He looked at Adrian with something between respect and warning. "You might have saved that plane. But the next battle's already circling overhead." Adrian nodded. He understood. The courtroom wasn't the end. The media would twist. The airline would deflect. And somewhere, more passengers would fly with wolves dressed in uniforms. He looked once more at the mirror, but this time, it wasn't his own reflection he saw. It was Elias, small, fragile, blinking through the plastic of an oxygen mask. That image would never leave him. He stood up. His wrists ached. His body still held the tension of that night, but his spine was straight, his will unbroken. When hidden shadows are exposed, even giants stumble. The courtroom fell into hushed anticipation as Adrian Vaylor stepped through the double doors, his polished shoes echoing on the tile floor like quiet declarations of purpose. He held Elias in his arms, the child bundled in a navy coat, his eyes wide but calm, unaware of the storm that had gathered around his father. The gallery was packed. Reporters, spectators, lawyers, and activists all craned their necks as the man who had turned an airplane into a battlefield of justice took his seat at the defendant's table. Each day of the trial had been a test of endurance. Adrian sat upright, his face carved from restraint, listening as witnesses took the stand one by one. Some were passengers from that flight, their voices quivering as they recounted the chilling silence that followed the duct tape. Others were experts, aviation consultants, psychologists, ethics professors, all debating whether his actions had crossed a line or redrawn one entirely. Through it all, Adrian never spoke out of turn. He answered when asked. He looked into the eyes of every juror, and he never once looked at Marcus Wren. The footage Damon Crowe had captured played again and again in the courtroom. It showed Marcus's cold approach, the act of suffocation, and Adrian's feral response, rage, grief, and instinct all colliding in one brutal moment. The prosecution tried to paint him as unhinged, a man who let emotion override reason. But each time, the defense countered with evidence of Marcus's past complaints, the pills found in the bag, and, most powerfully, the silence that came after Elias's cries vanished. Then came the day Marcus took the stand. He looked thinner than before, paler, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal's. He tried to explain his actions, claimed he had only meant to calm the child, that the duct tape was never meant to harm, but his voice cracked under cross-examination. The prosecutor pressed him hard, asking why he had a pouch full of tape, why the sedatives were in his possession, why so many colleagues had called him unstable in prior reports. Marcus stammered, offering half-truths and contradictions. It was then that another twist landed in the courtroom like thunder. A maintenance worker named Rylan Marr, quiet and unnoticed until now, came forward with an affidavit. He had once filed a report about Marcus's violent behavior during a flight maintenance delay, a report that vanished from the system days later. Called to testify, Rylan stood firm. "They told me to keep quiet," he said, his voice firm but bitter. "Said we couldn't afford another lawsuit. So they erased it. But I remember what I saw." Gasps filled the courtroom. Adrian's lawyer turned slowly toward the jury box, letting the weight of those words settle. It wasn't just a story of a man defending his son. It was now the story of an airline that had protected a predator for the sake of profit. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like days. Adrian sat alone in the hallway, Elias asleep against his chest. He stared at the ceiling tiles, his mind looping through every moment on that plane. The fear, the fury, the silence. He had not acted for glory or headlines. He had acted because his son's life had hung by a thread, and he would do it again without hesitation. When the courtroom reconvened, everyone rose as the jury returned. The foreman, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a steady gaze, stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. We find that his actions were justified under the circumstances of extreme duress." The breath Adrian had held for months finally escaped him. He closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in exhausted relief. Murmurs filled the room, some clapping softly, others sitting in stunned silence. But Adrian's eyes only found Elias, now awake, his small hand curled around his father's finger. Marcus was not as lucky. He was convicted on multiple counts, including attempted murder and endangering passengers. The courtroom watched in silence as he was escorted out in handcuffs, the same duct tape having long since left his face but not the memories of those who had seen it. And the airline, stripped of its public trust and facing a wave of lawsuits, was forced into full-scale investigation. The CEO resigned. Internal documents leaked. A reckoning began. Yet in the weeks that followed, Adrian made a decision no one had predicted. He did not return to the corner office of his tech empire. He left the board in the hands of his deputies and stepped back from the spotlight. In a quiet press conference attended by few but watched by millions, Adrian announced the formation of a nonprofit organization, Skyguard Alliance. Its mission was simple: to defend the rights of passengers, expose hidden abuses in air travel, and ensure that what happened on his flight would never happen again. "Airlines were never meant to be places of silence," he said into the microphone, his voice clear. "They were meant to take people safely from one place to another." We will make sure they remember that he paused, his eyes falling to Elias, playing quietly with the toy plane on the floor beside him. "Every rule broken on that flight was born from neglect. Every reform we fight for now will be born from love." From that day forward, Adrian became something more than a CEO or a courtroom survivor. He became a voice, and Elias, once nearly silenced forever, became the quiet reason behind every speech, every reform, every stand his father took. Adrian's journey had begun with grief, twisted into vengeance, and ended with a legacy that would ripple far beyond a single flight. From a roll of tape came not just justice, but change written in the skies. A minute later, the father struck back. The same duct tape became the attendant's downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and abuse of authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke reflection on accountability, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and equality.